This was back in 2015. We all have those strange compulsions, don't we? Those little ideas that lodge themselves in our minds and just demand to be acted upon. For me, mine was a place, an abandoned fire lookout, perched on a remote peak, in a forest a few hours from my home. I'd seen fragments of it online, and I was genuinely, deeply excited to explore it. There's a certain pull to places that have been forgotten, places where human activity has just stopped. But this trip came with a disclaimer. I should mention, clearly, that it was technically illegal to go inside or to camp there. These structures, they're just left to the elements. They aren't maintained. And the Forest Service warns that they could be structurally unstable, which is, of course, just a polite way of saying they could collapse and kill you. Now, I'd done my research. I scoured old hiking forums, message boards, and most people, in those hushed digital tones, said that it seemed okay. But the last post I could find about this specific lookout was 3 years old. And 3 years, that's a long time for entropy to do its work. 3 years of storms, of rot, of silence. I really didn't know what I'd find when I got up there. Would it be a pile of splinters? Would it be occupied? That last thought flickered, but I dismissed it. I mean, who would be up there? Anyway, I drove out. I found a small, discreet ditch on the side of a forgotten service road, just wide enough to hide my car from any casual passers-by. Not that there would be any. I got out, shouldered my backpack, which was packed with 2 days' worth of gear, and I started the hike. For trips like this, there are no defined paths, no friendly trail markers, no cleared brush. This was a 5-hour commitment to just bushwhacking. I used a handheld satellite GPS, my tiny digital lifeline, to make sure I was generally heading the right way. But really, the whole time, I was just cutting through completely unknown terrain. The forest floor was a mess, fallen limbs, thick undergrowth. And the further in I got, the more dense and rough the terrain became. The silence was profound. It wasn't just quiet. It was an active, heavy absence of sound. No cars, no planes, no voices. Just the crack of my own footsteps and the sound of my breathing, which, in that silence, seemed offensively loud. I was banking everything on the fire, lookout still being intact. My entire plan for shelter rested on this decaying, illegal structure. I guess if it wasn't, well, I'd just have to find a semi-flat piece of ground nearby, set up my tent, and sleep. But that just wasn't the adventure I'd come for. After several tiring, grueling hours of climbing and pushing through the woods, I finally got there. I saw it first as a break in the canopy, then a dark shape, peeking out above the trees, like a skeletal watchtower. When I got closer, emerging into the small clearing at its base, it actually looked decent, solid, even. The paint was worn off, of course reduced to pale, cancerous-looking chips. But the main structure, it seemed to be holding up well against the slow, crushing weight of nature. I went to the massive support beams at the base, gave them a few hard pushes, completely solid. So, I tried my luck. I started climbing the ladder. It was metal, and it felt sturdy under my boots, but it still creaked with every single step up. A high metallic groan of protest that just echoed out into the empty forest. It was the only sound for miles. When I got to the top, I was in awe, just for a moment. The views were staggering. I could see the entire forest, a 360-degree ocean of green and shadow. No buildings, no roads, no houses, for miles, in any direction. It was just the woods, the sheer overwhelming isolation of the place. It finally, truly settled on me. After taking in the view, I went around the narrow ledge and inside the lookout's cabin. It was really small, not like one of those big ones you see get turned into luxury Airbnbs. This was just one room, maybe 150 square feet, built for function and for solitude. It had a decaying bed frame in the corner, its mattress long since rotted into mush, an old wooden desk in the other, rotting window frames spanning the entire wall, their glass shattered or missing. There wasn't too much else to look at, just dust and the ghosts of whoever had last manned this post decades ago. I put my bag down, rolled out my mattress and sleeping bag, and then heated up a meal on my mini camping stove. Once the sun began to set, I walked back out onto the ledge to watch it. You see a lot of sunsets, but this one was different. This wasn't just a view. It felt like the view. I was above everything, a solitary spectator to the world turning dark. It was by far one of the best I'd ever seen, but it felt like it went by too quickly. The sun dipped, the colors flared, and then, almost like a switch was thrown, it was just darkness. A profound, crushing darkness that only exists in true wilderness. It was cloudy out, too, which smothered everything. No moonlight, no stars, just an opaque, inky blackness that pressed in from all sides, making the little 150 square foot cabin at my back feel like the only solid thing in the universe. With nothing else to do, I stayed sitting out on the ledge for a while, my legs dangling over the abyss. The silence had changed. In the daylight, it was peaceful. Now, it was heavy. It was a listening silence. It was probably an hour into this total night when I saw it. Something below me. There was a light moving around in the trees, but it wasn't the sharp, white, focused beam of a flashlight. What was strange about it, what made the skin on my arms prickle, was that it wasn't an artificial light at all. It had this deep, orange-ish hue, and it was flickering. It moved with a chaotic, leaping rhythm, like a campfire would if the campfire was moving. This led me to the only and most disturbing conclusion. It was a torch, an open flame. He, or it, was moving between the trees in the forest, not too far from where I was. I just watched it, frozen. My mind was racing to find a rational explanation. The chances of someone else being out here at the exact same time as me, in such a remote, trailless part of the woods, were already infinitesimally slim. But the idea of that person also traveling around at night, not with a normal, high-powered flashlight, but with a primitive, dangerous torch, that was just wrong. It was bizarre. It was anachronistic. It felt like something from a different century. I watched as the light bobbed and weaved under the trees for a while, a single, dancing spark in a sea of black. Then, it just went behind something, perhaps a dense patch of trees or a dip in the terrain, and I could no longer see it. I waited. For the next 30 minutes, I stared into that spot, my eyes straining until they ached, but I never saw it appear again. It was gone. I still stayed out on the ledge, though I was trying to reclaim that feeling of peace, to take in the calmness and the quietness of the night again, telling myself it was just another hiker, a very, very strange hiker. Eventually, the wind started to pick up, a high, lonely sound whistling through the gaps in the cabin's walls. It started to get a bit cold, the wind chill biting through my jacket. So, I stood up, stretching my stiff legs to take in one last view before heading inside. And that's when I saw him. When I looked directly below the ledge, someone was there. They were standing stock still in the grassy open area right at the base of the tower, between the structure and the tree line. Just standing. It looked, from the angle of their head, like they were looking directly up at me. My heart didn't just jump. It felt like it stopped. Maybe it was the person with the light I saw earlier. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin, pathetic. I didn't know what else to say. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They just stood there, a lightless, humanoid shape in the gloom, staring up. It was just this strange, agonizing 10 or 15 seconds of us looking at each other. My mind was screaming. Then, they slowly lifted up their hand. Not a wave, not a threat. It was a gesture, almost like an acknowledging gesture, or maybe apologizing. Then, just as slowly, they turned around and walked silently into the woods, vanishing into the darkness they came from, still with no light on, obviously. That was incredibly creepy. It was fundamentally eerie. But the human mind is desperate for normalcy. For some reason, in that moment, I felt so sure, or I forced myself to be sure, that it was just another hiker. Someone who also wanted to stay in the lookout. He was probably just looking up, trying to see if anyone was inside already. Why he hesitated to respond, and why he only lifted his hand. I don't know. I couldn't explain that. I didn't want to. I stayed outside for a little longer, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing else. I went inside and zipped myself into my sleeping bag to warm up. It was a little bit hard to fall asleep. My senses were heightened, and every sound, the wind hitting the loose windows, the old wooden beams of the tower creaking under me, felt like a threat. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I managed to pass out. It's hard to really know how much time passed. In that deep, exhausted sleep. It could have been minutes or hours. But when I woke up completely. Instantly. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The wind had settled down, and the night was still. It was still very dark outside, a deep pre-dawn black. I opened my eyes, staring into the gloom of the tiny cabin, wondering why I was suddenly totally awake. And then I heard it, a familiar sound, the soft metallic creak of the ladder outside. My blood turned to ice. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought I must be mistaken. It was the wind. It was the tower settling. But then I heard it again, and again. A slow, steady, rhythmic sound. Someone was climbing up the ladder. I couldn't tell how far up or down they were. I could just hear the metal frame at the top of the ladder, right by the opening to the walkway. Protest with every single step they took. Outside the windows, it was completely, impossibly dark. There was no torch this time, no light at all. My mind was reeling. This was it. This was the person from before. They had come back. My heart was racing so fast it felt like a trapped bird. I unzipped my sleeping bag, the sound of the zipper roaring in the small space. I got up, and I grabbed my backpack, a pure, unthinking, instinctual movement, and walked onto the ledge. During the 20 or so seconds that it took to get from my sleeping bag to the door, the creaking changed. It got louder and faster, like they heard me move, like they were hurrying now. Then, Just as I made it out onto the ledge, the sound suddenly stopped. I stood in place, enveloped in the cold, damp night air, my body rigid. I was waiting for another sound, for a head to appear at the top of the ladder. Nothing. Just the heavy silence returned. I slowly walked around the walkway, my back pressed against the cabin wall, and peered around the corner at the opening to the ladder. No one was there. The platform at the top of the ladder was empty. I carefully walked closer. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I felt my heart rate increasing as I leaned over the railing and looked down. Nobody was on the ladder. It was empty, all the way to the ground. I was just in shock for a second, confused and terrified, and utterly unsure what the hell was going on. Was I going crazy? Did I dream it? It felt so real. Then, a sudden sequence of thundering footsteps came rushing around the wooden walkway from behind me. I only caught a glimpse of their dark figure, a frantic, human-shaped shadow, running between the windows on the other side of the cabin. It had been a trap. They were already up here. They were hiding on the other side of the walkway, waiting for me to lean over and check the ladder. They had lured me out. I didn't hesitate. I didn't scream. I didn't think. I lowered myself onto the ladder and I just went, hurrying down as fast as I could. It was terrifying, trying to climb down that slippery, creaking metal ladder in the pitch black, my whole body shaking so violently from the adrenaline rush I could barely hold on, and I could hear them. I could hear the sounds of someone right above me, fumbling, getting onto the ladder themselves. Someone was chasing me. I got halfway down before I made the mistake of looking up. I saw their head peer out from the opening above, a dark silhouette against the black sky, looking down right at me. I didn't stop until I got to the bottom. I let go, dropped the last few feet, and scrambled into the woods, crashing through the brush. Honestly, I don't know why I even grabbed my backpack when I got up. That blind, panicked instinct. It was the best decision I ever made. It may have saved my life, because it had my flashlight. It had my GPS. With my flashlight beam cutting a desperate, bouncing tunnel through the trees, I was able to find my bearings and hike my way out of there. That entire 4-hour hike back to my car was the worst experience of my life. Every shadow a monster, every snapped twig a pursuer. As far as I know, I wasn't followed. I made it to my car, threw my bag in, and drove away. I never looked back. I was camping at a small lake for the weekend. Now, to be clear, this wasn't supposed to be anything special, nothing memorable. It was just supposed to be a few quiet days out in the woods, by the water. A simple reset button, you know, a chance to relax and unplug from everything. And for the first 24 hours, it was perfect. It was exactly that. I got there, set up my modest camp, cracked a drink, and just chilled. I let the silence of the place soak in. A silence so profound, it felt almost physical, like a heavy blanket. You see, this spot was out in the middle of nowhere. I mean nowhere. It's not the kind of place you find on a blog or some top 10 list. It's only accessible by this thin, almost invisible footpath, way off an old logging road. It certainly wasn't marked on any maps. As far as I knew, only the deepest locals would even know it existed. My dad used to take me here when I was a kid. It was our spot. We'd fish, tell stories, and just enjoy being completely, totally alone. In all my years going out to that spot, both as a kid with my dad and now as an adult by myself, never once had I ever seen another soul. Not one. Honestly, thinking back, there was never even any sign of anyone. No old fire rings, no forgotten trash, Not even old boot prints. It was always pristine. Like nature just reset it the moment we left. That perfect isolation. That's why I came back. My second day started just as peacefully. I spent my time walking around the water's edge, a slow, meditative loop. The air was still. The water was like glass. And I just thought, processing the week, breathing in air that didn't taste like concrete and exhaust. I must have circled that lake 3, maybe 4 times. During those hours of walking, everything was quiet and nice. The only sound was the crunch of my own boots on the damp earth. But then, on one of my laps, something caught my eye. I stopped. Down in the dirt, right on the edge of the tree line where the mud was softest, I spotted them. Footprints. My first thought was just a flicker of annoyance. Great, I thought. Someone else found my spot. But that feeling vanished in a millisecond, replaced by a cold, prickling confusion. I had been walking this exact same circle, over and over for hours. I never saw them before, and where they were so clear, so obvious against the dark soil. I don't think I could have missed them. They were pressed deep, and they looked new, disturbingly new. The edges were sharp, no erosion from the wind, no water having seeped into them. And that's when the real strangeness hit me. What was really, really strange wasn't just that someone else was out here. It was what the footprints were. They were literal footprints, as in barefoot. Not boot prints, not running shoes. The distinct, perfect impressions of 10 toes, a ball, an arch, and a heel. My mind raced, trying to find a logical reason, but the part of the lake I was at, this muddy bank, it didn't even have easy access to the water. It was thick with reeds. It's not like they took their boots off for a swim. Not to mention, the lake was a perfect mirror. I would have seen them. I would have heard them. Seeing this, it really creeped me out. The questions started stacking up, one on top of the other, each one darker than the last. Why didn't I see them? I'd been circling for hours. Were they watching me? Hiding just inside the tree line, waiting for me to pass so they could step out onto the path? Did they wait for me to pass and then follow me? It was hard not to get paranoid about it, hard not to suddenly feel like the quiet woods weren't empty at all, but just holding their breath. From what I could see, the footprints went right up to the tree line, stopped, looked out at the lake, and then went right back into the dense, dark woods. Straight back into a part of the forest I had no intention of ever entering. I didn't want to follow them. I just stood there for a long minute. The silence of the woods suddenly felt heavy, oppressive. Then, I turned, and I just walked, quickly, back to my campsite. That feeling of relaxation, completely shattered. I kept looking out at the lake. Or, I guess, more accurately, I was staring at the solid black wall of the tree line. I was searching for any flicker of movement, any shape that was out of place. I never saw anyone. But as the sun started to come down, that beautiful orange-red light, it just made the shadows deeper. And the paranoia, it started to build up again. It was a physical sensation, a coldness in my stomach that just spread outwards. Something about those footprints felt off, fundamentally wrong, knowing that they were likely still nearby, somewhere in those trees. It wasn't a comforting feeling. The isolation I had craved just hours before now felt like a trap. When it got dark, I fueled up the campfire. And I mean, I really fueled it up. I stacked wood on it until the flames were roaring, casting a wide, bright circle of light. This wasn't for warmth. This was to push the darkness back. A tangible barrier. I sat there, trying to keep my mind off of it. I pulled out my phone, knowing full well I had no signal. I fiddled with my gear. I did whatever I could to pretend this was normal, but it was pretty difficult, because my senses were screaming. Every snap from the fire, every rustle in the leaves, it made my head snap up. My heart just pounding in my chest. Part of me felt justified. My gut was telling me something was terribly, terribly wrong. But another, more rational part of me kept saying I was overreacting. So, some weird barefoot people were out here? Maybe they were just local eccentrics. Maybe it was a prank. I tried to calm myself down. I tried to breathe. But the air itself felt charged. And then, not too far into the night, I heard it. It was unmistakable. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a raccoon. It was footsteps. Approaching from the trees. From that same blackness I'd been staring into, I turned instantly, my whole body rigid, faced the darkness they were coming from. My heart didn't just pound. It felt like it stopped entirely. There were more than one. It sounded like two people, slowly, casually, walking closer to my campsite. The steps were heavy, but soft. A contradiction that made my skin crawl. I just stared, unblinking, into the darkness. My eyes were useless. I just waited. And then, suddenly, they came into the light. It was a man and a woman. They were walking next to each other, side by side, and they stopped. Just at the edge. Right at the edge of where the firelight could reach. They stood there, perfectly still, like statues. I couldn't see their faces. The firelight danced and threw strange shadows, making their features just swim. I couldn't see their clothes, or anything more than their basic human shape. I couldn't tell if they were old or young. They just stood there, watching me. My voice. It came out as a dry croak. "Can I help you?" As soon as I said that, the woman, the one on the right, she moved. She turned. Not like a person, but like an animal. A deer spotting a predator. And she sprinted. She bolted back into the woods, crashing through the underbrush, and was just gone. Disappeared completely. But the man stayed. He stayed exactly where he was. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look back at the woman who just fled. He just kept staring. It was then that my eyes, darting around frantically, looked down, and I realized he wasn't wearing any shoes. His feet were planted in the dirt, caked in it. They were pale in the firelight. These were them. These were definitely the ones from the lake. My blood ran cold. The man who made the footprints was standing right in front of me. I tried again, my voice shaking. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer. He just stood there for another second. A long, agonizing beat of silence. Then, he, too, turned around. But he didn't run. He just turned, quietly, and walked back into the woods. He disappeared into the blackness, as if he were never there. I pretty much had an internal freak-out after that. That was, without question, the most unsettling, strange, and fundamentally wrong encounter I'd ever had. It almost didn't feel real. It felt like I had just watched two ghosts, two glitches in reality, appear and then vanish. And the one thing I knew, with absolute bone-deep certainty, was that I was not safe. I didn't want to be in those woods for another second. That wasn't a campsite anymore. It was a stage, and I was just some terrified animal trapped on it. The adrenaline hit me like a train. A cold, chemical fire that made my hands shake, but my mind go laser sharp. I immediately started to pack my things. I am not the kind of person to stick around when things get sketchy. You don't need to be brave. And this was so far beyond sketchy. It was in a different, terrifying universe. Thankfully, my setup was minimalist. Easy to put up and take down. I wasn't packing neatly. I was shoving. I jammed my sleeping bag into its sack, not even rolling it, just crushing it in with my fists. Tent poles clattered as I collapsed them. I had everything tied down, in my bag, and ready to go within a few minutes. I didn't know where they went, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I didn't want to be here when they came back. My fire, which moments ago had been my only comfort, now felt like a spotlight, a beacon, just advertising my location. I kicked out the unlit logs, scattering the embers into the dirt, doing what I could to kill it. The circle of light shrank, and the oppressive, total darkness of the deep woods, it just rushed in to reclaim the space. I slung my pack on, switched on my tiny headlamp. It felt useless. Its thin beam just emphasized how much blackness was all around me. I hurried into the woods, finding the footpath by sheer memory. The walk back to my truck was nearly 2 hours. For the first 10 minutes, I was really on edge. Every shadow was a person. Every snapped twig under my own boots made me jump. I was utterly, painfully unsure if I was being followed. But the further I got from the lake, the better I felt. Or at least, I thought I did. It was about 40 minutes into the walk. The initial panic had subsided into this grim, high-speed march. And that's when I noticed it. The silence. The wrong kind of silence. The whole woods was silent. Not just quiet. I mean dead silent. There were no crickets. No owls. No rustling of small animals. It was the kind of absolute, soundproof booth silence that only happens when a predator is near. And that's when I suddenly heard running footsteps. It was in the distance, maybe 100 feet from me, off to my right. And it was definitely a person, a frantic, sprinting sound. I couldn't see anything. My headlamp beam was too weak. It just bounced off the nearest trees. I froze, my heart in my throat. The running stopped. I had to just keep walking. I had no other choice. Only a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, on the other side of me, to my left. Again. A short, frantic burst of running, like someone dashing from one tree to another. And the footsteps. They seemed quieter than they should have been. Too soft. Not a... Which led me to the one horrifying conclusion. They were running barefoot, and it was the same two I'd seen at the lake. They weren't chasing me. They were hurting me, stalking me. If they'd been stalking me this far into the woods, who knows what they were trying to do? For a while, this pattern continued. The woods would be dead silent, and then a short burst of running in the distance. First on the right, then on the left. They were flanking me. They were quietly stalking me. Walking when I walked, and then suddenly sprinting, just to let me know they were still there. They were toying with me. I can't think of anything more terrifying than that walk. The thought of being chased is scary, but the thought of being played with by something you don't understand, in the pitch black, miles from safety, That is a different kind of terror. Somehow, I made it back to my truck. I saw the moonlight glinting off its windshield. I have never felt a wave of relief like it. I fumbled for my keys, threw my bag in the back, and got in, locking the doors before I even put the key in the ignition. I was able to make it out of there. I wish I had more to say. I wish I had a neat conclusion. Or that I figured out who that man and woman were, or what they were doing out there, barefoot, in the middle of nowhere. But I have nothing. Maybe I'm insane. Maybe I was just overtired and I hallucinated the whole thing. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if they were even alive or not. I don't know. And I'm not sure I want to. I never went back. I'm a 24-year-old female, originally from the high desert of northern Arizona. This story, however, takes place a couple of years ago. It was during a chapter of my life when I was living entirely out of a small camper van. I was tracing the jagged line of the West Coast, fueled by a desire for solitude and a different kind of freedom. Now, as you probably know, there are a lot of different lifestyles people build inside these vans. You have the weekend warriors, the Instagram influencers making it look like a permanent, perfect vacation, and then you have people like me. I always tried to keep out of the big cities. I'd use small towns as brief stops for supplies. And then I'd retreat. My real destinations were the spaces in between. For the most part, I liked to camp out in the back country. Being in the middle of the woods, with genuinely nobody else around for miles, that was where I found myself most comfortable. It's where I most enjoyed the core of that traveling lifestyle. I think a large part of it, especially as a solo woman, was the counterintuitive fact that it always felt safer to be out there by myself than it was to be stealth camping in some brightly lit, busy parking lot in the middle of a city. Don't get me wrong, the forest has its own brand of creepy. The snap of a twig in the dead of night can make your heart jump into your throat. But those are sounds you can eventually identify. A deer, a raccoon, the settling of the earth. In a city parking lot, the creepy is human. It's the shadow that lingers too long by your window, the tap on the glass at 3 a.m. Out in the woods, I always felt I was better off. The threats were natural, predictable, or so I believed. This particular week, I was slowly traveling between two big cities in Washington. I was taking my time, deliberately staying on the winding back roads, and just hunkering down at campsites for several days at a time. On this specific day, I pulled off the main road and onto a small dirt trail. It was a path that looked more like an old logging route than a designated camping area, and it plunged deep into the dense, dark green of a Washington forest. There were a few small pull-off spots near the entrance, but none were taken. The muddy ground looked like nobody had been down here in a while, so I kept going, pushing deeper and deeper in, hoping to secure a larger, more secluded spot further down. At the very end of the trail, the woods opened up into a large, perfect circle. It wasn't scenic in the traditional sense. No mountain vista or rushing river, just a clearing, completely surrounded by a thick, imposing wall of trees. But it was large, it was beautifully secluded, and it felt incredibly peaceful. It even had a stone circle in the middle, the ghost of old campfires. This was it. I leveled out my van and parked. Since it was the middle of spring in Washington, it was raining pretty much every day. This day was no exception. There wasn't much for me to do outside, so I opened the large sliding door on the side of my van, letting in the cool, damp air and the smell of pine, while I cooked an early dinner on my small propane stove. It was around sunset, though the heavy clouds made it feel much later. I still had several hours before I'd even think about sleeping. Over the next 30 minutes, the sun officially fell past the horizon. The light rain started to pick up, turning from a simple patter to a steady, heavy drumbeat. I slid the side door shut to keep the water out, and instead cracked open one of the small, high windows near the back of the van for ventilation. I settled onto my bed and watched a show on my laptop. But midway through the episode, a glare came in from the open window behind me. It was a light, sharp and white, reflecting onto the screen of my laptop. Before I was even able to react, before I could even process what it was, it went away. But it didn't move away, like a car turning around. It turned off, as if someone standing out there in the rain had just flipped a switch. I spun around and looked out the small window. Nothing, just pitch black, and the rain pouring down. I had no way to know how far the light had come from, or what it even was. Being on a trail that did have other pull-off spots, my brain scrambled for a logical answer. I had to assume it was just another camper, arriving late. Maybe their headlights had somehow found a freak gap through the dense trees and shined into my window. Then they quickly turned their vehicle off. The only problem with that theory, the one my gut couldn't ignore, was the location. The light didn't come from the road I came down. Behind that specific window was just a solid, thick wall of trees. Maybe there was another trail I didn't know about. There wasn't much investigating I could do anyway. Not in this weather. So, with a deep sense of unease, I turned back around and tried to get back into my laptop. Occasionally, I'd check the windows, my eyes darting from the laptop screen to the black rectangles of glass. I'd think I heard something outside, a muffled footstep or a swish against the side of the van. But with the rain clanking and hammering against the metal roof, it wasn't clear. The storm was creating 1,000 false positives, and I couldn't be sure if I was actually hearing something or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. Primed by that strange, sudden light. Every time I looked, though, I never saw anything to confirm that something or someone was out there. So I tried not to worry myself too much. I tried to force my brain back into the simple plot of the show I was watching. I want to say it was about 10 or 11 p.m. when I finally decided to call it in for the night and try to sleep. The rain was my enemy now, but also my cover. I turned off everything in the van, the lights, the laptop, plunging the interior into an immediate heavy darkness. I closed all the windows completely and drew the shades, sealing myself in. It was nearly pitch black inside, a void so complete I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I got under the covers and tried to sleep. Usually, I didn't have much trouble at all. The gentle rocking of the van, the sound of nature, it was my lullaby. But tonight, I just couldn't manage to fall asleep. My body was tense, my ears straining against the noise of the storm. Unfortunately, the rain picked up even more after an hour. And then the thunder started. It wasn't distant, rolling thunder. It was the kind that cracks right overhead, an explosive, splitting sound that vibrated through the metal shell of the van and deep into my chest. It was impossibly loud and made it impossible to even try to sleep. I was just lying there, wide awake, a prisoner in my own bed. It was about 2 hours into the night, somewhere past 1 a.m., and through all the harsh rain and the violent claps of thunder, I swear I heard something move outside. It wasn't a maybe sound. It was just loud enough, and just different enough from the storm, for me to know I really heard something. It sounded like someone, or something large, running. A heavy, pounding footfall, and then the unmistakable crack of a thick branch being kicked over or snapped on the ground, somewhere just outside of my van. As soon as I heard it, there were no other sounds, just the storm, which suddenly seemed to quiet down in comparison to the adrenaline roaring in my ears. My heart was pounding. I crept up to the window nearest my bed and peeled back the cover, just a fraction of an inch. It was so dark I couldn't even see the ground beneath the window. It was just a sheet of black, lashed with rain. The longer I looked out there, the more uneasy I felt. I just had this horrible, primal feeling, like someone else was looking back at me. A feeling of being observed, targeted. I quickly put the window cover back down. I sat there, frozen, trying to tell myself I was overreacting. It was the storm. It was an animal. A bear. Anything but a person. But only a minute later, I heard a voice. It was a male voice, and it was in a loud whisper, like they were talking to someone else right next to them. The sound cut right through the rain. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It was casual, confident. I sat in absolute, petrified silence, too scared to even breathe, too scared to open the covers and look out the windows again. I knew they'd probably see the movement if they hadn't already seen me, but the truth was, they likely already could assume someone was in the van. The van was my home. Where else would I be? And that thought made it all the more terrifying. There was a good 2 or 3 minutes where I didn't hear anything aside from the relentless rain and the rumbling thunder. And then, suddenly, there was something right outside the sliding side door. It was the sound of bending plastic, a faint creak and groan, like someone was slowly leaning their full body weight against the side of the van. And then there was a knock. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the metal door. Knock, knock, knock. A few seconds later, they knocked again. Even though I was sure they knew I was in here already, I was still too scared to speak. My silence was my only defense. Maybe they weren't sure how many people were inside, or if I was a man or a woman. I felt safer not giving them anything, just staying absolutely deathly quiet. A very disturbing and anxious 5 minutes went by as the knocking continued, every few seconds, methodical and patient. Knock, knock, knock. Without anyone saying a single word. They had to be drenched by now, completely soaked to the bone, and probably couldn't see at all through this weather. But they didn't stop. And then, finally, they said something. A man's voice, muffled by the door and the storm, called out, "Sheriff's Department, open up!" What? I didn't believe that for a second. My blood ran cold. It felt like a line from a cheap horror movie. If it were true, why knock in silence for 5 solid minutes? Why not announce themselves from the very beginning? With the authority and procedure a real officer would use, they continued knocking, the raps becoming harder, more insistent. They started calling out different lines, but they all carried the same message, that they were an officer, and I needed to open the door. This wasn't a rescue. This was a tactic. It felt like a desperate, almost clumsy attempt to get me to open up without them having to resort to violence. Like a predator trying to coax its prey out of hiding. I had to see. I had to know what I was dealing with. My hand was shaking, but I slowly, painfully slowly, lifted the window cover on the side door. Just a tiny sliver. All I could see was a single, dark figure, a silhouette moving erratically near the door. But from the shape of it, the way it moved, it didn't look like he had any sort of law enforcement gear on. No reflective vest, no broad-shouldered uniform, no utility belt, just a person. A person standing in a torrential downpour at 1 a.m., lying about who they were, trying to get into my van. I was sure this was about to get really, really bad. I debated in my head what to do. A frantic 30 seconds that felt like an hour, as the knocking got more and more impatient, almost angry. My only option was the driver's seat. It was a risk. I'd have to expose myself, move from the back of the van to the front, and the sound of me starting the engine would give me away instantly. But staying here, waiting for them to break a window or force the lock, was not an option. I decided to go. As soon as I lunged up there and turned the engine on, the engine roaring to life, I heard 2 sets of footsteps. Not 1, 2. They were running, splashing through the mud, up to the side of the van. I threw the van into drive and began pulling out, the tires spinning for a terrifying second in the mud. Just as a figure appeared in the window right next to me, a dark shape lunging at the glass. Thank God, the van got traction. I stomped on the gas, and the van shot forward, fishtailing wildly before I was able to get it out onto the main trail. I didn't look back. As I drove away, speeding down that dirt road as fast as I dared. I never saw any other vehicle, not parked on the trail, not hidden in the trees, not down by the main road. This only makes the intentions of these unknown people, these 2 men, all the more disturbing. They had walked here, or hidden their car far away, all to wait in the storm. I put in a report with the county as soon as I was in the next town. They, of course, said that no officers were out there that night. They took my statement, but I never got any follow-up. Things could have gotten really, really bad out there. I haven't had anything else happen since then, but I'll never forget that feeling. The sound of that quiet, patient knock in the middle of the storm, and the voice that lied to try and get in.